took over as president from Stuart Robinson on the 1st of January this year, I was given this. This contains all the secrets of how to be an OR Society president. I have to actually hide it now. If any of you get hold of it and you're not going to be the president in 2 years' time, then I'd have to shoot you. So that's, the important thing about that is it does contain some words of wisdom from past presidents, some of which I'm going to be calling on here. I should say also I'm going to be calling on the wisdom of the 4 people who looked at an earlier draft of this talk. That was Sue Merchant, Jeff Royston, Stuart Robinson and John Hopes. I'm not going to name check them after this. So anything is, some people call it plagiarism. I call it seamless integration of other minds and so on. I've also nicked the OR Society's new branding because I'm sure the OR Society would love their new branding to be shared. But actually, any views here have not been run past the board or the council of the OR Society. They're all my own, and I'm sure that plenty of people will want to at least query or ask questions. So, I am going to be talking about dimensions of diversity within the OR community, looking at some of the opportunities they present, but also the challenges they bring, and considering how we can address them to make the most of the community that we've got. I'm talking about this because I think it's interesting, because I hope it'll be thought-provoking and a nice way to kick off the conference. But also I have a deeper purpose, and I'm going to come on to that deeper purpose in a moment. But before I do that, I'm just going to remind you what I'm going to talk about. Sorry, spoke through the slide. Before launching into that agenda, I just want to ask you a few questions. And I'm going to ask you to stick your hands up. That's a demonstration. None of this, you might. And I'm going to kick off just because I would like to know who's in the room, and not because I want to point you out at all. I just want to check. How many people are here as a one-off? You don't actually want to be, you don't consider yourself as somebody who's part of OR in any way, but you have something of interest at this conference. Is there anybody who's not really an OR at all? Welcome. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you find this an interesting, that was 2 hands went up, by the way, 2 hands I saw. I hope you find it interesting. And I'd be interested to find out afterwards if there's anything of direct value to where you're coming from and where you are coming from. My next question is, how many of you feel that OR is flourishing and growing? Okay, quite a small proportion of the audience. So that I was thinking it might be different. These are people who not only made it down to Portsmouth for an OR conference, you've made it up at 9 o'clock, 9:30 in the morning for the first session, and only about a third of the hands that went up felt that OR is flourishing and growing. My next question, how many of you deep down inside feel that you are a proper OR person? Well, that is even more interesting, because I would say at least half the hands went up, nowhere near 100%, but at least half the hands went up. So there's a good number of you who feel that you're a proper OR person, but that OR is not flourishing and growing, which is a tiny, depressing way of spending your working career. But let's just move on from that one and say, how many of you would say that you're active within the OR community? Well, and that's also a great number, but still nowhere near 100%. So my deeper agenda is this. My deeper agenda is to persuade everybody, you walk out of this room thinking to yourself, the OR world is vibrant, it is important, it is interesting. That you go out of this thinking, this is a world where I belong. And I'm not asking you, when you say you belong to the OR world, I'm not asking you to think, you know, I therefore do not belong to the world of Leyton Orient supporters, or I do not belong to the world of statisticians, or I do not belong to the world of the Neighbourhood Watch. You can belong to lots of worlds, and one of the worlds that you feel that you belong to, I hope, as you leave this room, except for those two who definitely don't want to, is belonging to the OR world. And then finally, I would like you to feel that this is a world where you want to continue to be, if you already are, or become, if you aren't, active and engaged, because it's worth everybody's while for you to do that. So if you already feel all of those things, then that's absolutely great. You should have all of your prejudices reinforced by this talk, which means you'll be happy, because that's the best kind of talk to go to, as long as it's interesting. And the rest of you, I would just like you to pick up some of these vibes. So that is at the end of working my way through where we are. And I'm going to talk then about aspects of diversity, because I think it is the diversity of OR that leads to many of these mixed messages that we get from a typical OR audience. I'm starting with a quote from my little stick. 1958, the presidential address. I think this was the first presidential address given to the society. And that immediately provides us with two of my three aspects of diversity that I want to look at. And I think I think there will be at least half the audience who've already picked up one of it, one of the points. The older people in the audience will remember when you entered a profession where people talked about OR men. That was it. That's how it started. At least those are the stories that have come. I don't have any information about whether there were any women involved in wartime OR, apart from what we've seen in the Enigma stuff. But in the creation stories of OR, I've not come across any female names. Maybe others can correct me. So the first aspect of diversity is these surface characteristics, personal characteristics. So there are 9 in the UK, there are 9 so-called protected characteristics, which are protected by law. Sex, race, the Sex Equality Act, what was it called? Sex Equality Act, I think only became law in 1975. The Race Relations Act became law in 1965, and other various personal characteristics have become protected by law. That is, it is legal to discriminate in certain circumstances only more recently. But there are plenty of other surface characteristics on which we do discriminate. I mean, social class is a classic. There was something in the papers only the other day about people wearing brown shoes to interviews. Men wearing brown shoes to interviews do not get the job because people from the right social classes know that you would never wear brown shoes to interviews. Accent is a very big one, particularly UK regional accents and some other non-national British accents are very influential in the UK and no doubt elsewhere. My personal one is height. I'm absolutely convinced that this is a source of discrimination against which I've had a fight, coming from Essex, supporting Leyton Orient, etc. These are all factors, surface factors. They're absolutely irrelevant to your competence, but they can lead to exclusion. And I'm going to talk later on about what the OR Society is doing in relation to this particular aspect of diversity. But going back to Kendall, the second aspect of diversity is just the variety of OR. I mean, I'm sure the injecting a little vigour into a flagging conversation was just Kendall's way of telling you that he had a sense of humour. But it's the diversity of the professional activities that go on in OR as a result of that hugely broad field that is OR is one of the main themes of diversity of the talk that I will be covering in more detail later on. And just the third aspect of diversity, I'm only going to touch on this one towards the end of my discussion of diversity, is everything else that makes you, you. So what we call the deep personal characteristics, your own life experience, your own values, tremendously important, Your preference is also important. Your personal style. All of these other aspects of what makes a person different from other people are significant aspects of diversity that I shall talk about. I'll just pause to catch up with my notes and move on to surface characteristics. What are we doing in the OR Society relevant to the general equality and diversity agenda, if you like? Last year, Stuart Robinson, on behalf of the OR Society, signed the Science Council's Declaration on Diversity, Equality and Inclusion. The OR Society is a member of the Science Council, and the Science Council has launched this initiative, which it expects in due course all its members to sign, in order to ensure that the fields of scientific endeavour are open to everybody. So why have we signed up to this commitment? So I'll just say a little bit more about what the commitment is. We have committed to proactively promote a culture of equality, diversity and inclusion. We've appointed, that requires us to appoint a board-level diversity champion and so on. So why? What is it that for the OR Society has made this important to do? And we're not doing it because the Science Council requires us to. Had we been doing it for that reason, we would have reconsidered our membership of the Science Council. The first thing is, why would you not do it? We are a society that is looking to build our reach, the ripples that we spread. We're looking to build the visibility of operational research. We're looking for more active engagement amongst the community within operational research. We want more people to teach, to research, to practice OR. We shouldn't be trying to allow any group to evade these clutches. We shouldn't be excluding anybody if we can possibly avoid it. Another thing is that we should be practicing what we preach. We have a statement of ethical principles. I won't embarrass you by asking you how many of you have read it, and I'm sure that most of you are actually working in line with it. Amongst other things, we are expected to adopt the highest standards of professional conduct. We're asked to be alert to the ways our work might affect others and respect the rights and reputations of others. We're asked to act honourably and responsibly, to aspire to high standards of leadership, and to show that we are seeking to serve wider society. This is all part of ethical practice. And finally, there is a proposition, and it's a proposition that I will be coming on later to when I talk about opportunities. There's a proposition that diversity is good for operational research. So plenty of reasons to want to promote this. What actually are we doing or have we done so far? We're actually at relatively early days. We have appointed a board-level champion, Sayara Beg, who I think is not here yet, but is coming down tomorrow. We have started to run courses in unconscious bias training, which so far all of our staff and our general counsel have taken, and we will be spreading to other volunteers. We are benchmarking our membership and making plans for integrating good practice into our work. All of these things will be familiar to many of you if you come from large organisations. They are not new. We're just a little bit behind the curve in actually doing it and recognising it's something that we need to do. We don't actually know if there is an issue in the profession. We don't know if we're short of women. There are certainly lots of women around. Whether they are in the senior grades, some are. Whether they are as many in the senior grades as there should be, I don't know. We've had, I'm the third woman president of the OR Society. And there's certainly been women presidents of Euro, women presidents of Informs. We have only had one Blackett lecturer who's a woman in the history of the Blackett lecture. I don't think we've had any Beale Medal winners who are female. Whether that reflects deeper issues within the profession or deeper issues in society, I think is a question that is still open and is one that we ought to be pursuing. When we look at race, there are certainly a lot of non-British people who are involved in operational research and practicing and researching operational research in the UK, and we've clearly got OR spread around the world. I wouldn't know how many of those are British-born and non-white, which is the community of real concern when it comes to those who are promoting equal rights. And I don't know if there are any issues in our practice that affect that. So again, something that we ought to start looking at. And I have no idea if we are doing anything that is inappropriate excluding people with the less visible characteristics, such as gender orientation and so on. So we have a fair amount of work to do in building our knowledge. We're just taking the first steps in benchmarking. So I'm going to move on now to professional activities. And Kendall observed that there are many ways of interpreting OR. I am not going to spend much of this talk on definitions, what is OR, but we can't get away with not having some sort of basis. I'll just pick up some of the interpretations, some of the definitions that have been used before. I should say at this point that actually a lot of textbooks avoid giving definitions of operational research. They will spend 2 or 3 chapters describing the characteristics of operational research to bring you into to the idea of what is operational research. That is definitely the approach I would prefer to take, but there are occasions when somebody says to you what is operational research, they just will not accept you thrusting a textbook in their hands and inviting you to read the first 3 chapters. So you do sometimes need that short, snappy definition. And these are some of them through the years. They started fairly general, and they begin to become much more technical. I believe this one was the first snappy definition of the OR Society produced. This is the more recent definition. I think we've now changed that advanced to appropriate, which is slightly less meaningful than advanced, but not much. This was Jeff Royston's definition from his presidential address and Stuart Robinson's from his. This was actually, I'm cheating because this was one of mine that I used when trying to persuade people why we were doing what we were doing. And this is the one that drove me mad when I entered the profession, but actually is the one that I've come to believe is actually where we are. I'm going to take, for the moment, I'm going to take as a working definition one of the very earliest definitions of OR from Waddington, one of our founding fathers. And I'm just going to pick out two points from that, which we will cling to. It's the general method of science. That means that it involves observation. It involves starting from what is, not what we would like to be or what we would hope to be. There's all sorts of questions about measurement, about how the difference between the actual real world and the perception of the real world and so on, which we won't go into. But there are definite characteristics of the scientific method that are well established. And there are many definitions also of the executive. And the one that I would particularly use here is a definition of relating to or having the power to put plans or actions into effect. So I'm not talking about executives as people in snazzy suits who might just happen to be interested in something. This is executive as in changing the world, making things happen. So those are the 2 key features of OR from the beginning that are engaged in the definition that I'm using from the start. And I will come back to how that's grown in a moment. And I'm going to talk now about what is going on under the heading of OR around. I'm particularly focused on what's going on in the UK, but we can't help spreading across the world because OR, in my view, is flourishing and it is flourishing in, across the world at least as much as it is locally in the UK. What I was going to do at this stage was a quick sort of snappy 2-minute overview of the industries where OR is involved, the problem areas, problem types, methods. I was only going to take a couple of minutes. The task defeated me, and because actually the organisers have been disgracefully disrespectful, in my view, to the president, they've only given me an hour. I can't do that. All I can do is just draw your attention to a few things. I'm going to wave the conference handbook at you and say there is a lot going on. If you look at particularly OR in health, huge amounts of activity. OR in public policy, huge amounts of activity. OR in transport, in logistics, vast amounts going on. I will point you towards the European Journal of Operational Research, not just because I've got an editor in the room, invited reviews and a whole area of activities, fortnight after fortnight after fortnight. Another set of invited review, another invited review on progress in a specific field. I point you to our own new Impact magazine with its case studies, and again we have the editor in the room, Graham. I would point you to the recent annual Analytics Day agendas with their variety of case studies and presentations. To the President's Medal, to past President's Medal. Jamila talked about what's going to be at the coming President's Medal. I talked to some of the things that have been presented at past President's Medals. These are all really exciting things. I'm going to pick out some particular highlights for me, and basically I've narrowed down the highlights. I wrote round to a few people and said, what are you doing that might be of interest to an audience? And I got so much back, I've basically narrowed it down to the number of pictures I had time to load up. Fascinated by Gerald Midgley at Hull has just got a big grant, as part of a huge grant from the Ministry of Agriculture in the States, looking at use of antibiotics in agriculture and finding win-win ways of reducing farmers' use of antibiotics. And in telling me about that, he also told me that actually some of the work he's been doing is currently being developed in Colombia to embed the peace treaty with FARC that's just been signed to actually make it happen at the local level, which is amazing. That's based on the operational research that's been going on at Hull. Right at the other end of the technical scale, in Edinburgh, we've got the plenary at the end of this conference on big data. Julian Hall has done work which has enabled the development of the simplex method, which I last used about 36 years ago, I think, to solve a problem which had about 20 variables and was completely unsuited to the simplex method. He's just extended it, so it will deal with 500,000 variables, and it was done as theoretical research. It's already been used to support modelling in the state of Illinois, for where wind power, we all know the Windy City is Chicago in Illinois, wind power coming onto the grid. When you do your on-off for the wind power on the grid, this is resolved by a 500,000 variable simplex model. And it's being used elsewhere and can be used elsewhere in agriculture. So it's been looking at sustainable development in Brazil and in insurance, wherever. DSTL, we hear a lot about their work. Previous President's Medal was in Afghanistan. Also designing new field hospitals to deal with the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone. That's out in the field. Back at the desk, the Ministry of Justice has just produced, it's been through all of their data using Tableau to make it more accessible both to outsiders who might want to do things with the data and insiders, so that the data, the policies can be based on data and evidence-driven. Away from the desk, up to outer space, where work from Jürgen Flieger in Southampton has been helping Rosetta and Philae, just we found Philae, to reach a comet This is work on getting trajectories through space. I'm told that's not simple, to actually get this tiny little thing to meet that tiny little thing at distance of millions of miles, with other things going on around, it being space. Back down to Earth, rebuilding Bond Street Tube Station, complex modelling of passenger movements by London Underground, UK border controls. I do hope that those of you who have come from overseas didn't have too much of a queue at the UK border controls. If you did, it would have been something that even operational research couldn't deal with, like not being able to stop the wind from blowing your plane in too soon. But if you didn't, it's entirely down to the operational research modelling. So those are some highlights which, to me, they show that there is a lot going on in operational research, that it is contributing to important issues. They only tell part of the story, and certainly not everything that we do is so inspirational. So back to Richard Ormerod, who talked about OR having smart bits, the techie bits, helpful ways, which is the things we do just to help the executive make their changes, and things that matter. And the things that we tend to shout about here are the things that matter and the smart bits, rather more than we talk about the helpful ways. But I worked in practice for decades. I can't remember if it was 3 or 4. I've been in and out of OR. And I know that the things that you want to present as projects at conference only cover a part of what you're actually doing. So that was a demonstration of the inspirational, vibrant stuff. I think I want to talk now more about other aspects of the diversity of what goes on under the umbrella of OR. So I know that as a practitioner, for everything that you want to publish or to talk about or to tell people about at parties, there are probably at least half a dozen things which you don't want to mention. Many of them will have fallen under the helpful ways bit, so kind of definitely counting. But they may have been really useful in a somewhat less than earth-shattering way. So for a short period or for a particular purpose which doesn't have long-term reverberations. They may have been maintenance jobs, just something was done last year and the only person who can bring it up to date is you, just because nobody else has got the basic skills to do it. They may have failed to gain traction. Maybe the client moved on partway through. Maybe the world moved on. They may actually have just been the wrong thing to be doing, or they may have been done badly or in a mediocre way or put across badly or not met the need at the time. So there are a lot of things that actually go on under the heading of OR that some of them shouldn't be going on. Some of them are actually bad OR and we should be trying to root them out. But I think some of them are just the price that we pay when we're looking at these things in practice. It's the price that we pay for engaging in real-world OR and getting people to continue to pay us to engage in real-world OR. You throw yourself wholeheartedly into this, and some of the things that come out of it are noise or wastage. You don't get 100% use of your brilliant brains. And I've been to enough OR conferences as a practitioner to know that the academic world also has some issues with things which maybe are talked about, but perhaps are not worth talking about. Development of really abstruse adjustments to standard methods simply because we can, or some pseudo application where actually no manager in their right mind would put the time and energy into the work that it would require to adopt the proposed OR solution. And actually, like mediocre practitioner work, some of this should be rooted out, but some of it is the price you pay. In academia, it's the price you pay for having openness, freedom of thought, and the growth of wisdom in people as they move through their career. But all of this, if we're looking at what goes on in OR, this is all part of the diversity of OR as it is done in the real world. There's also, I'm not going to go into it, so I've talked about different sorts of projects, different sorts of applications, different sorts of industries. There's a pretty vast range of methods. I think I read somewhere that in the 1996 Encyclopedia of OR methods, there were over 200 methods. I'm sure that there are more now. Most of these methods were not developed within the OR community. Most of them have been adopted from elsewhere. But many of them have become part of the OR canon. And I just do want to stop and say there is an OR canon. There are some methods, many methods, over 200 methods, which are seen as respectable OR methods that you can teach in an OR world. You can talk about at OR conferences, and people say, yeah, that's OR. The OR practitioner is actually continually adopting new methods and grabbing them in, and OR researchers too are always looking outside, what can we bring in, what's going on there, what comes in. So the toolkit is continually growing. Maybe 15 years ago, maybe social network analysis wasn't part of the tools. 10 years ago, much of what we now see from the analytics, coming through from analytics and data science, wasn't part of the toolkit. Certainly data visualization is a relatively recent thing that's come into the standard OR toolkit. So there is a diverse and increasingly diverse collection of methods, some of which are labelled in the canon and some of which, for some reason, don't count. Adding to this, I'm going to just sort of pick up some of the things that an OR person does, and we can start with the not OR methods. So maybe social research methods, survey design, actual project management, as opposed to the OR contribution to how to do better project management, cost accounting, which one of the early presidential addresses said should be part of what is taught to operational researchers, is not seen as an OR method, but an OR person may be doing it. Statistics, certainly. And then a whole load of other things that you are doing with your day when you are OR. These are skills that an OR person needs if they are to see things through to their fruition. So one of the difficulties when we come to looking at what is going on in OR is how do you capture all of this in one description of what is OR. I've just been describing OR as being diverse. I hope that you've picked up on that message. It's diverse. Is it more diverse than other disciplines? So statistics, for example, appears everywhere. Maths appears everywhere. It's used in multiple applications. Is OR any different? And to answer that, I'm just going to look at the challenge that OR sets itself and what it set itself right at the start, from that looking at any problems which are of interest to the executive. The concept for OR people, or one concept which many OR people will be familiar with, is one borrowed from cybernetics, which is the law of requisite variety, which is you need as many ways of controlling something as that thing has of varying. So we have set ourselves a very varied task. We've said executives, wherever they are, in any industry, whatever their problem is, and those problems will vary from executive to executive, from time to time, within the same industry, within the same organisation. They will, a huge varied, what do they consider to be problems now? What are they trying to achieve now? And those goals will vary from time to time. The local features, local circumstances will affect what is the best way of tackling this particular problem now. The circumstances, the whole picture will change over time. The problems of today are not the problems of tomorrow. The technologies of today are not the technologies of tomorrow. So what we did yesterday and today, we will have to do differently tomorrow. And finally, when we've got it working, when we have found ways of helping somebody to deal with their problem using our scientific method, the chances are we then pass it on to somebody who can make it their day job. So inevitably, OR is continually dealing with novelty. And really that's what science is about. Science, the implicit thing about science is its observation, it's finding out stuff about things you didn't know before. So it's novel, it's bringing in innovation. So yes, I do think that OR is necessarily more diverse than most other professions. I'd certainly put it somewhere at the top end of the diversity scale by its nature. And that's one of the reasons why it keeps adopting new tools, because problems can be anywhere, and you look at what you need to deal with that particular problem. OR has actually moved on, though, since Waddington's day. It's gone beyond employing science to study the problem of interest to the executive. There's been a huge development, of course, of types of problem since Waddington's day, huge development of application areas since Waddington's day, many developments of tools. I'm not sure that there were typical tools in 1946. Now, tools are everywhere. We cannot stop ourselves by, however much we intend to focus on OR as an activity. The tools keep coming into our discourse. So there are loads of typical tools of operational research. We now have textbooks, we now have qualifications, we have courses in OR. We now have, of course, an enormous body, more people here are researchers than are practitioners, a huge body of OR research. We have software, which means that to be an OR person, you are no longer necessarily what Waddington and what our founding fathers were, which was people who were employed within an organisation to help that organisation deal with its problems. So initially within the military branches of government to go off and win the war. So they were what I would call general practitioners. They would pick up the problems that were required there and then. We now have specialist practitioners who will only pick up problems that fall into a particular category. We have people who teach, we have people who research, whether they're driven by the theory, so driven by the idea of developing the methods, or driven by the practice, moving things forward, making more effective world out there with their research. And software developers. So there are plenty of roles now that fall under the heading of OR that go beyond what was in the mind of that simple definition. And these headings are not just carried out, this work is not just carried out within the organisation, that's the in-house practitioner. Is it in-house? It could be an external consultant. If you're in-house, you could be in a central group, or you could be bedded out just working with a small subset of the organisation. You could be on your own as an OR person or part of a group. And if you're in a university, you could be in a maths department, as we are here at Portsmouth. You could be in a business school. You could be in a department of engineering, and plenty of other places. So again, that's another source of diversity when we look at what's going on in OR. The founding fathers joined OR at the peak of their careers. These were people who were recognised as as outstanding, already having work under their belt, and they came into OR. And it can be quite hard to identify with that if you just stepped off your undergraduate or your master's course or even out of your PhD. So we now have a whole hierarchy of people who are working in OR but who cannot necessarily see themselves in the role models. So I just want to, those were the various dimensions of professional activity that I wanted to pick up. And I will say later on why I've picked out those dimensions of professional activity and not others. Just touch everything else that makes you, you. And I talked before, this is your values, your experience, your life experience, your beliefs, your preferences, how you behave, what you do. And we're all slightly different. We have massive overlaps. We have probably much more in common than we have difference. But everything else that makes you, you, I think is important in OR to pick up as an aspect of diversity. And that is because OR is not just about technical challenges. OR is about human challenges. It's about human problems. It's about working with human problem owners. And we engage with those human problem owners through our own humanity. And it is our differences. And we all, anybody who's worked with a problem owner, or indeed with any other colleague, knows how much more comfortable it is and how much further you can go when the chemistry is right, and how difficult it is when the chemistry is wrong. Usually the chemistry is okay, but you just need to acknowledge these differences as well as others. I think it's really worth doing. So, in my abstract, I described the, sorry, that's that picture. In my abstract, I described the diversity within OR as glorious. I think it really is glorious. I think that range of applications that I've described should be a source of inspiration to all of us. I think it's interesting. I think the people that do OR are interesting. They may not always be able to write about it in an interesting way, but they are interesting. You won't be at an OR conference long, I hope, and I hope you will all take advantage of this before you find yourself engaged in an interesting conversation. So it's a great field to be in from that point of view. So what are the opportunities? This huge range of problems and the diverse workforce that deals with this range of problems means that there is enormous scope for multidisciplinary lots of people working together, and that expands the range of problems we can deal with. A great reinforcing loop. Multidisciplinarity, thank you, was actually one of the, appeared in the definition of OR for some decades after its founding. So it is a key part of the vision of OR that it is multidisciplinary. So delighted to hear that OR here at Portsmouth is part of the re-energizing of that multidisciplinarity. So it's a fantastic opportunity. If you're part of the OR community, I may not know somebody who can deal with a problem, but I will know somebody who can. So even if I myself don't have a multidisciplinary group that I'm working within, this is a multidisciplinary community, and there are people within it who may be able to work with you. The diversity literature is full of information about how diversity can links to creativity. So if you have a diverse team, you are more open to other perspectives. You are more open to other sources of knowledge. You're more open to ways of thinking, other ways of thinking. You're more able to absorb these other ways of thinking, which all helps enhance creativity. And from the other side, the creativity literature has plenty about how if you bring in other ideas, this helps to enhance creativity. So tremendous opportunities from the diversity that is around us. The risks, though, are also quite substantial. There's a risk of mistrust, risk that you don't know what's going on in the other group, you don't respect what's going on in another group, you risk failing to communicate across those boundaries between the different sorts of activity that are going on. You simply don't understand the language that the other people are using or the way that they do it or why they're doing what they're doing. There is a risk of conflict between groups and definitely a risk of having in-groups and out-groups, feeling that the out-group feeling that the in-group know it all and they are left out. There's a risk also of groups splitting off and going their own way. And that can strengthen and it can weaken, both or either, depending on the circumstances. So one way of dealing with such risks, these are well-known risks of diversity. One way of dealing with the risks is to establish some overarching common view of what it is you are, an overarching common identity. And that would be great if we could. But we've just been seeing how difficult it is for OR to establish where OR starts and not OR ends. The boundary between OR is contingent. It depends on the circumstances. It keeps changing over time. It moves. And that leads us to two major problems for operational research. And these are familiar to any of you who've been around for any length of time at all. The first question is, how do you explain to people what you are selling? The difficulty of selling OR then becomes a self-reinforcing problem because people know if people are trying to sell their work to others and sell their competence to others, they don't want to label it OR because OR doesn't sell. So they label it where we hear supply chain logistics at Portsmouth. I'm not going to go through all the labels because I'm already running out of time. And then that has the knock-on consequence that it is difficult to locate and promote OR work as being OR work. So people will try and find descriptors that mean something different, and it can become self-defeating if you are trying to build multidisciplinarity around the variety of stuff that you do. The second big issue, and this is why I'm asking whether people feel that they're real OR people, is it really undermines your sense of professional identity. Now, if you have a sense of professional identity, it brings all sorts of things. All sorts of good things come from knowing what you are as a professional. If you don't have those, if you don't think you're really an OR person, you are less likely to come to OR meetings and conferences, though we've seen, doesn't rule it out. I'm delighted that so many of you are here. You're less likely to feel confident sharing your experiences, less likely to seek the relevant professional development, less likely to keep in touch when you move on to other fields. And that is bad for you, it's bad for your professional development, and it's bad for the profession. So this is just the point where I pick up my earlier promise, which said, why have I picked, when I was talking about the diversity of OR activity, why did I pick those particular categories? And the reason was that these are where people look across the boundary and think, those are the real OR people, it's not me. Or those people over there are not doing anything that is of interest to me, I don't want to talk to them. They are the dangerous categorizations. It's another reason why I'm really pleased that the Portsmouth Conference Committee has picked up this academic practitioner link, which is one of our most undermining boundaries, but there are so many others. So, and the big one that is of concern when I ask people, do you think you're really OR, is this narrative, this continual narrative that people have for themselves that I'm not really doing OR because I am not really using OR techniques. We know that OR is not about its techniques. If it was, how would we know what techniques to adopt from elsewhere when we see something useful? But that narrative that OR is about its techniques is extraordinarily strong. So what is the OR Society doing about it? What can we do about it? I'll just summarise that argument. So far, I've said OR's aspirations are huge, leads to huge diversity in the OR community, which offers strength, inspiration, opportunity, but it risks lack of collaboration, marketing difficulties, shaky professional identity. What are we doing? We have a vision statement, which I hope most people in this room can sign on to, and that helps. We want to go a stage further, and we're just at the very early stages of articulating beyond this to commission materials which will fit somewhere between that snappy definition, which doesn't actually say it, and that textbook that does really convey what OR is to anybody who is willing to spend a couple of hours locating it and several days reading it. So we're hoping to bring together a suite of materials which will be there for outsiders, but also for ourselves, to articulate for ourselves this is what we are. We are introducing new labels which people can use to affirm their own identity. The Chartered Scientist is a Science Council label which will enable people to say, this is what we mean by science. And we have, hopefully, we are in the process of applying to be licensed by the Science Council to offer that to our members. The process is going well, and we're hoping to be able to offer that if the Science Council agrees early next year. And there is somebody from the Science Council coming to talk about that tomorrow. We are also hoping to become franchised to offer the INFORMS, the US Society's Certified Analytics Professional, which is an examination-based qualification, which says I can do the sums. And you can add those to your masters. Those are both continuing professional development labels, which means you are demonstrating that you are continuing to show this. Those should be accessible to any members of the OR community who choose them, who choose to label themselves in this way. We should be acting inclusively. That means we need an overarching narrative which does not bring out continually the toolkit and talks about the wider competence of being able to solve problems and knowing how to address problems. We need inclusive materials, inclusive practices. We must not set up a wall. We are not Trump. We are not Israel. We are not Berlin. We need free movement across boundaries. We can cope with that. We do not need to police our boundaries. We have a good, strong, sellable proposition in fundamental OR. However, then, it spreads out around us. And if people can move across those boundaries, that's great. If people can feel they have a foot in both camps, if they can say, not, I'm interested in OR, I'm really a statistician, but I'm interested in OR. But if they can say, I am a statistician as well as an OR person, that is our the best of all worlds. That's really what we're after. Accepting multiple professional identities. And there's work Frances O'Brien is doing on multiple professional identities, which is well worth catching up with if you can. Just very quickly, because my 10-minute warning hasn't come. Wake up, 10-minute warning man. Just personally, we can make the best use of this diversity with, just take a few concepts. Concept of serendipity, just bumping into somebody. Sanja Petrovic, who set up the debate session, which I'm delighted that Carl and Stuart will be undertaking later on in the conference, can't be here because she's in Cuba talking about some work which she did with, and was only possible because she bumped into and met and became professionally connected to somebody working in a completely different field at an OR Society event. That was Jane Parkin, in fact. The concept of social capital from social network analysis, that you know people, if you know people in different networks, that's great. The further apart those networks are that you can communicate across, even better. You can bring people together, you can call on diverse people. Concept of social capital is something that we should really be building on in OR practice. Concept of unknown unknowns. There is nothing like, and I'm sure many of you have had this experience, there is nothing like presenting your work to an interested party who comes from a different department or a different organisation or a different specialty to find out just how much you did not know about how that specialty or department is doing work which relates to what you're doing and actually makes a difference. So an underlying concept, final concept I want to throw up is the concept of the boundary spanning mindset. Just be comfortable with the ambiguity of working across boundaries and the interest of what is happening on the other side of the boundary. So that brings on to the final message of what we can all do more of. The OR Society, I think, could do more to develop and strengthen our infrastructure and our opportunities for networking. We have regional societies, but apart from a few honourable exceptions, they're not terribly active. We could make them more active. We have special interest groups which could be more active. We're certainly trying to enable people to network when they come to events. And you, I would like to ask all of you to stay involved in the OR Society if you're not already, to become involved to stay involved if you are, to become involved if you're not, to take the opportunities that are offered by events like this, to enjoy the opportunity to meet people and to experience for yourself the benefits of diversity. So I've covered dimensions, opportunities, challenges, some of the actions that we can do. I've touched on the way on OR's strategic goals, and this particular aspect of that I'm talking about, diversity, really relates to how we can build the OR and the Occupational Research Society community, which will help build the visibility of our profession and build the reach of the good things that the Society is doing. And then I said beforehand, this was my underlying purpose, that you would all, I'm not going to ask you to put up hands because I don't know what answer I would get. You should only ask questions when you know the answer you would get. But I would like you all to go away with feeling of moved towards belief in these. If you're already there, great. I hope I haven't put you off. If you weren't, I hope you have moved towards these. Because if we can all manage the risks of diversity and exploit the opportunities it gives us, then that will benefit all of us. So thank you all very much.